Hello, CryptoLiveLeak. My name is Patrick Conlin, here live at Token Fest Boston 2018. I'm here with Kawa Foad, who is a securities lawyer based out of Miami, and we're here to ask a couple of questions concerning regulations in the SEC. So, Kawa, I'd like to begin. Can you define for me the difference between a security token and a utility token?
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me, first and foremost. So utility token, let's start with that one. Basically, the definition for security, whenever the Congress passes an act, we don't really know the scope of the act until it's been tested in the courts. And that's what happened in 1945 with the SEC versus Howey. The Supreme Court laid out a four-part test that defines what an investment contract was, an investment scheme. And it said that if you satisfy these four elements, you're dealing with a security for purposes of the Securities Act of 1933. So in that sense, that you need to have an investment of money with an expectation of profit derived solely from the efforts of others, the managerial efforts of others, okay? And it needs to be in a common enterprise. The investment of money needs to be in a common enterprise. You satisfy those four prongs, you have a security. Utility token, by definition then, is anything that does not satisfy all those four elements. So if you have a situation, a token, that there's no expectation of profit because the foundation that is issuing these tokens, they don't pay out any dividends like that, then yes, you do have a utility token. But one thing that the SEC has looked at a lot in the past, with the few guidance that we have from them, the very few guidance reports we have from them, is that if you have a platform that's not even fully developed and you're raising funds, then you're more likely to be deemed a security. Whereas if you have a fully functional platform and you're looking to raise cash, and those tokens you issue out, it can only be used on your platform, then more than likely you're a utility token. And as I was talking to you briefly before, the perfect analogy is take Dave & Buster's, for instance. You go in there with your fiat currency, your $20 bill, you insert it to the machine, you get credits. Those credits can only be used at Dave & Buster's. And you're buying them for one specific reason, not to trade them, not to make money off them, you buy them to use them at the arcade games. So it's utilitarian in nature. I hope that explains the difference a little bit.
Thank you, that's very clear for our users. So how do you see the SEC's enforcement actions changing over time with respect to securities?
Okay, well, there's a couple of things to consider. First and foremost, why does the SEC, exist to begin with? The SEC, as probably most people know, they were created by the Exchange Act of 1934, and the SEC was created primarily to enforce the laws that was passed the year before that, the Securities Act and the Exchange Act as well. The SEC is not the big bad wolf. They're out there to protect the average investors, the public, from predatory practices from issuers. So keeping that in mind, the SEC is not out there to get companies. They're not trying to hinder your ability to raise cash. They just want you to do it on fair terms. They want you to be fully open about the material risk of your business. And once you've done that and if you comply with them, then you're free to raise cash. But just make sure that you're complying with the rules and regulations. Now, as far as recent trend goes or future trend goes, we're definitely going to see more rules promulgated under the Securities Act and under the mandate that the SEC has, where they're going to try to crack down on utility tokens that have been tokens that are disguised as utility tokens, but they're really securities, and they should have been registered with the SEC, or at least they should have filed with an exemption. So I think over time you're going to see rules that's going to basically crack down on these fraudulent ICOs. But if you're legitimate, you don't really have anything to worry about.
So do you see the SEC kind of expanding their reach outside of just ICOs?
Well, you have the trend of security token offerings, which is basically an alter ego of the traditional fundraising efforts, whether it be through a debt security or an equity security. Their jurisdiction it cannot be altered. They cannot alter themselves. Whatever was mandated to them through the Securities Act, that's what they have. So unless Congress comes out and amends the Securities Act to some extent to give them power to regulate over things that are not securities, then the SEC can't really step outside of the jurisdiction.
And that's a great way to segue. So outside of congressional legislation, which it doesn't appear there's anything in the works at this moment, do you believe we'll continue to see policy evolve through SEC enforcement actions?
And that's actually a great way of saying it, because remember one thing, that you don't see these big, massive acts come out that often from Congress anymore. Congress is not doing its job. So what you have instead is that policy and rulemaking done at the administrative level. So you have all these agencies. They don't have, they have the act to go upon their mandate, but then they promulgate these rules, these finer rules and, directives and, whatever you want to call them. That's actually where the real lawmaking is happening through these actions by the agency. So the SEC coming out with their investigative report on Dow, for instance, or Munchies. That's going to set the standard, and I think they're going to become more active. They formed a group within the SEC now, fully focused on blockchain and cryptocurrencies. So you're definitely going to see more action from them as time progresses.
And so, with the lack of action at the federal level, we're seeing states to begin to take action. How do you see blue sky laws evolving?
Well, remember one thing, under the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution, if there's a conflict between a state law versus a federal law will supersede. So they can only create laws that are not conflicting with federal law. So it's very hard to predict what they will do, but SEC has pretty wide mandate. They have a very wide jurisdiction. Unless they can come up with some creative way of not conflicting with the Securities Act of '33, I'm seeing a hard time of states, being able to promulgate new laws or rules. That's gonna, I just don't see it. I think the SEC has wide enough jurisdiction that they can govern most of the things.
Well, I think that's great news. Another question I have is regarding security exemption. So companies that file for ICO projects with the SEC may be exempt under some different forms. So can you just briefly explain to me the difference between crowdfunding versus Reg D and 506C?
Okay, so I'll be very frank with you. There's not a whole lot to go on, but I can tell you what I know. Crowdfunding was passed through the Jobs Act of 2012. It was a provision that was added on to the Jobs Act. And that basically allows you to raise $1,070,000 using crowdfunding efforts, and you can only raise $1,070,000 from the last 12 months, the last trailing 12 months. Reg D filings, there's a couple of different exemptions available. 506 is one of them as well. It's part of the rules. So you can, to use a term that's probably not the most appropriate, but there's several ways of skinning the cat. So you can do it through the, accredited investors route. You can have you can raise unlimited funds as long as all your investors are accredited investors, and you provide all the disclosures, you do all the proper filings with the SEC. But basically, what you need to keep in mind is that anytime you sell securities, something that is a security under the definition, you have to talk to the SEC one way or the other. Now, whether it's going to be a full registration, the traditional IPO that most people know about, or if it's going to be through an exemption, you still need to notify the SEC. So, two things to keep in mind. If you're doing a traditional IPO like companies did back in the day, it's called a registration statement. But if you're doing an exemption, you still file. You're telling the SEC, hey, I'm selling securities, but I'm exempt under the Securities Act because this is the way I'm raising the cash.
So the days of white paper and a dream are over. So, again, the SEC is there to protect investors. Thank you so much for your time, Kawa, and helping to educate our viewers.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks. Appreciate it.